Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 282, Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2 for the light heavyweight title is almost here. It's only a couple weeks away, and it's the last UFC pay-per-view of 2022. And while I'm very excited for this card, this video is going to be my top 3 reasons I hate UFC 282. And again, don't get me wrong. I like the card. I'm excited for the card. It's a very good card. But all 3 of the reasons, and actually I'm going to give you 5 reasons because I have a couple honorable mentions as well. But every single reason I give you for why I hate UFC 282 is a legitimate complaint I have about the card. And I'm also going to do a video later this week, a grading UFC 282, where I'll go through the entire main card, grade it on a scale from 1 to 10, and then at the end of the video, I'll answer the question whether or not you should buy UFC 282. So if you want to see those videos as well, make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. I do those types of videos for every single UFC pay-per-view. Now, before I get into my honorable mentions and then my reasons, what I'm going to do is go from 3 to 1, 3 being, the reason I least hate UFC 282, and number 1 being the reason I most hate UFC 282. I'm going to start with the honorable mentions, obviously, first. And before I get into those reasons, I want you to comment down below and let me know, are there any reasons that you hate UFC 282? Maybe there's something I'm going to miss in this video, and I'm curious of everyone else's opinion on UFC 282. So starting off with the honorable mentions, and the first honorable mention that I have is very subjective. It may very well not happen. But the first honorable mention is that Darren Till is probably going to pull out of his fight against Dricus du Plessis. I know that's super subjective and may not happen. That is a very good fight on the prelims of UFC 282. I'm really looking forward to seeing Darren Till versus Dricus du Plessis. This could be the end of Darren Till. But Darren Till has pulled out of 4 of his last 5 fights. He pulled out of his fight with Jack Hermansson in December of 2020. He pulled out of his fight in April of 2021 against Marvin Vettori. He pulled out of his fight with Derek Brunson in August of 2021. And then eventually he fought Derek Brunson at the end of 2021. And then he pulled out of a fight with Jack Hermansson July of this year. So he's just constantly pulling out of fights. He's constantly injured. And I'm really looking forward to his fight at UFC 282 because I think it's a massive fight for both Dricus as well as Darren Till. Because with the middleweight division, I know you got Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira. They're going to have probably an immediate rematch. But Darren Till, he gets a win or two, strings a couple wins together, and he's right in line for a middleweight title. And I just hate to see him go out the way he has. He's lost 4 out of his last 5. The one fight he won against Kelvin Gastelum was a split decision. The fight, he won before that was against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, which most people thought he lost that fight, and it was a robbery for Darren Till in that fight. So I just, and then he's had the constant injuries. He had a very competitive fight with Robert Whittaker, who's widely considered, I guess now the 3rd best middleweight in the division. But he's just constant injury after injury after injury, pulling out of every fight. And I'm just worried that he's probably not going to make this fight against Dricus. I can already see it. Darren Till pulls out of the fight against Dricus for undisclosed reasons, some type of injury. But that's very subjective. That's why I made it an honorable mention. The second honorable mention I have for why I hate UFC 282 is because we have Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Robbie Lawler. I hate this fight in general, but I also hate that it's on the main card. I mean, this fight, on the surface, if you don't watch MMA, you're like, this fight kind of makes sense. Ponzinibbio is on a 2-fight losing streak. He's 36 years old. Then you have Robbie Lawler, who's won 1 out of his last 6, which is absolutely insane. And that 1 win is against Nick Diaz, and he's 40 years old. So it kind of makes sense, but no. Santiago Ponzinibbio and Robbie Lawler have no business fighting each other. This is a massive mismatch. The only fight Robbie Lawler has won in the past few years, I mean, since 2017, he's won 1 fight, and that was against Nick Diaz at UFC 266, where Nick Diaz just came in completely out of shape, wasn't ready to fight, and then quit mid-fight. And while Robbie Lawler looked good in that fight, or okay in that fight, and then he looked good against Brian Barberina at UFC 276, he eventually got TKO'd in that fight. And I just think Santiago Ponzinibbio is a massive mismatch for Robbie Lawler. I think Ponzinibbio is going to go out there and brutally KO Robbie Lawler. And Robbie Lawler is one of my favorite fighters. And he's 40 years old. I just feel like they could have found a little bit better matchup. Maybe matched him up with Tony Ferguson. That would be a fight where loser retires. I just think I get it on the surface. It kind of makes sense. But at the same time, I absolutely think it's a massive mismatch. And if you look at the rankings on Tapology, Ponzinibbio is ranked number 16 on Tapology. Robbie Lawler is ranked number 67. That is absolutely insane. And for Ponzinibbio, his 2-fight losing streak, he lost by split decision in his last 2 fights. And I think there's an argument to be made that he won his last 2 fights. I mean, Michel Pereira was a very close fight. I thought Ponzinibbio could have easily took that fight. The Jeff Neal fight was very, very close as well. He could have easily won that fight. So Ponzinibbio could be on a 3-fight winning streak right now. And, you know, Robbie Lawler's just that only win is against Nick Diaz. He got TKO'd by Brian Barberita, lost to Neil Magny, lost to Colby Covington, lost to Ben Askren, lost to Rafael Dos Anjos. I just think this is a terrible fight to make, and I hate that it's even on the main card. But it is what it is. That's why I made that an honorable mention. I found some other reasons why I hated UFC 282 more. So moving on to reason number 3, I hate UFC 282. And that is Paddy Pimblett versus Jarrett Gordon. And more specifically, I wish Paddy Pimblett would have got a bigger step up in competition. I understand Jarrett Gordon's an okay fighter, okay? He is an all right fighter. I think he's probably a slight step up from Jordan Levitt, but not by much. And I get it. I understand what the UFC is doing here. I 100% understand. Paddy Pimblett has the future to become a massive star within the UFC. He's already very popular. And of course, he's a UK fighter. The UFC wants to kind of expand that market and be able to have headliners over in the UK. But I just think they could have came up with a lot better than Jarrett Gordon. I get it. They want to get Paddy Pimblett to win. I think I favor Paddy Pimblett to beat Jarrett Gordon. I think he's an okay fighter. But, you know, there's just so many better options. I would have loved to seen Paddy Pimblett versus Jim Miller. I mean, Jim Miller has just been sending back contender after contender. And I'm not saying necessarily, oh, I want to see Paddy Pimblett lose. But I think Jim Miller would have been a very good test. I think that's a winnable matchup for Paddy Pimblett. But it would have been like, okay, we kind of have an assessment on his skills now. Because you can only continue to fight lower level competition forever. And while Jarrett Gordon, you know, he's won 4 out of his last 5. Look who he's beaten. Leonardo Santos by decision. Joe Solecki by split decision. Danny Chavez by decision. He hasn't got a finish in the UFC since his UFC debut all the way back in June of 2017. And every single one of his losses, he's been KO'd or submitted. I think he has 3 losses via KO or TKO and 1 loss via submission. So this is a matchup where the UFC is like saying, okay, you know, we can get Paddy Pimblett a little bit more experience and we're going to get him an easy win. I think Jarrett Gordon has a slight chance to beat him, but I don't think it's super likely. And for me, I'm like, well, what's the point of even watching this? I think Paddy Pimblett is going to be bigger. I think he has way more power in his hands. I think Jarrett Gordon, you know, has been a little bit chinny in his past. He's been knocked out 4 times in his MMA career. And I just think this is a matchup where the UFC looked at both fighters and they're like, okay, we can get Paddy Pimblett a little bit more experience and we can get another win under his belt on a big pay-per-view card in Las Vegas. So I'm not really looking forward to this. Another option I would have loved to see Paddy Pimblett against, Terrence McKinney, another unranked lightweight, a young guy as well. But I know the UFC is looking at Terrence McKinney. They're looking at his crazy power and his super aggressive style. And they're seeing the fact that Paddy Pimblett got hurt in pretty much every single one of his fights outside of Jordan Levitt. You know, the Luigi Vendramini almost gets finished in. He got tagged by Rodrigo Vargas. And they're looking at Terrence McKinney and they're saying, okay, Terrence McKinney's probably going to brutally KO Paddy Pimblett and derail the hype train. But that's a fight I would have loved to see. Another fight I would have loved to see. And this one's kind of a little bit more unrealistic because of weight class. But Paddy Pimblett versus Ilia Topuria. And I know Topuria's fighting on this same card against Bryce Mitchell in a fight I'm really looking forward to. But they have that beef where they got in that altercation back in UFC London. I think it was in July or maybe it was June. They have that history there. Topuria's fought at lightweight. He fought at lightweight in his last fight. And he's calling out Paddy Pimblett left and right. And I don't think Topuria is ranked in the top 15 at lightweight. I think he's barely ranked at featherweight. And I think that fight would have been very, very interesting because Topuria is very good on the ground. And also Topuria has nasty power in his hands. So there's just a million fights that the UFC could have made that I think would have been more compelling. And I know somebody's going to think, oh, you just want Paddy Pimblett to lose. No, I just wanted a better assessment of his skills. And for me, Paddy Pimblett beating Jarrett Gordon doesn't tell me anything. So moving on to the number 2 reason I hate UFC 282, and that's the main event that could have been. We were teased for months about Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic, or Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou, for either an interim heavyweight title fight against Stipe Miocic or a heavyweight title fight against Francis Ngannou. And for whatever reason, neither one of those fights materialized. And it just sucks, because imagine a card that is the same as it is now, but imagine having Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones as the main event, or Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic for an interim heavyweight title fight, which I don't necessarily like the interim title fights, but I just want to see Jon Jones at heavyweight. He hasn't fought since February of 2020 against Dominic Reyes. Everyone wants to see the heavyweight debut of Jon Jones, and it's just super unfortunate that for whatever reason the UFC couldn't come to a deal. There was talks of it happening in September, and then there was talks of, okay, we're going to get 2 title headliners for UFC 282, and the UFC held out putting out a press release for what was the main event, even though they already announced Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira. They never said it was the main event initially, and most people thought, okay, we're going to get Jon Jones on this card at heavyweight against either Stipe or Francis Ngannou. And I'm just kind of disappointed thinking about the card that could have been, and thinking about that main event and co-main event combination. You have Jon Jones fighting on the same card where his former title is being defended by Jiri Prochazka, the light heavyweight division. I just think it would have been awesome to see. And I think Jon Jones's return at heavyweight, regardless of who he's fighting, I think is one of the biggest fights the UFC can make. And I think outside of like a Conor McGregor fight, or, you know, maybe like a Jorge Masvidal fight, which I don't even know about Jorge Masvidal anymore, I think one of the very few fights that the UFC can do that's over 1 million buys would be Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou, or Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic. I think it would do big numbers for the UFC. And I mean, the fans would absolutely love it. The fans are dying to see Jon Jones debut at heavyweight. And at this point, I'm starting to get a little bit discouraged. I don't think it's ever going to happen. I'm hopeful that it'll happen maybe the March pay-per-view of 2023 in Las Vegas. But it's just, I mean, it was teased for like a month and a half, and it never came to fruition. So that is one of the reasons that I hate UFC 282. I just really wish Jon Jones was on the card, regardless of who he was facing, because apparently he came to terms with the UFC, and apparently Stipe Miocic wouldn't sign a deal or couldn't come to terms with the UFC. Francis Ngannou needed more time because of the injury. So it just sucks, because we could have had an amazing pay-per-view card to end the year, and instead we get a decent card, but it could have been much bigger had that heavyweight title fight been added to this card. Moving on to the number 1 reason I hate UFC 282, and I'm wondering how many of you guys have guessed this reason before I even got to it, and that is the fact that there is a very real possibility that Glover Teixeira wins the light heavyweight title and retires. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love Glover Teixeira, okay? He's one of my favorite fighters. I was so happy for him to be able to claim the light heavyweight title 7 years after he initially fought for it against Jon Jones. I've never heard anyone speak a bad word about Glover Teixeira in the MMA community. And he just seems like an all-around great guy. He's been fighting forever. I've always kind of dreamt of seeing him hold a UFC title, and it kind of looked for a while that he was going to be on his way out the door. And he was able to go out there, string together a couple impressive wins, get a title fight against Jan Blachowicz, and dominate him in that title fight. And then he makes his first title defense against Jiri Prochazka in one of the most exciting fights of all time. And he gets submitted in the 5th round of a fight that he would have won had it gone to the scorecards. And I was kind of thinking, well, this is a great way for Glover Teixeira to go out. He had one of the greatest fights of all time, probably the greatest light heavyweight fight of all time. In my opinion, it is. And he would have won, but he got submitted last second. Let's just let him retire right off into the sunset. But instead, the UFC decides to rebook it. And I just find it hard to believe that, first off, is Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2 going to live up to the hype of the first fight? I just don't see any possible way they top that first fight. There were so many momentum swings. Then they had a crazy finish at the end. And you have the fact that the fighter that was losing wins with like 30 seconds to go. And in the last 2 minutes of the fight, I mean, Glover Teixeira was in full mount, beating Jiri Prochazka up on the scorecards, and somehow Jiri finds a way out and eventually gets that rear naked choke, which is just absolutely insane. And, you know, I don't think either guy lost stock in that fight. And even though Glover lost the title, I thought this is a good time for him to retire. He's 43 years old. The young in this sport perpetually eats the old. Glover's been hurt, you know, quite a few times, even in the fights that he's winning. And I thought, okay, maybe he'll retire now. Well, instead, they're rebooking this fight. And don't get me wrong, I'm excited for this fight. I'm looking forward to this fight. And I like Jiri Prochazka. I like Glover Teixeira. But we just finally recently got some legitimacy to the 205-pound UFC division because Jon Jones's shadow was looming over it for a long time. And yes, did Dominic Reyes arguably beating Jon Jones kind of help with that? Yes, but still, there was that shadow lingering over top of the division. And now it seems that, you know, we had Jan Blachowicz win the belt, and then we had Glover Teixeira win the belt, and now we had Jiri Prochazka win the belt. Kind of that shadow's gone. People are questioning, could Jon Jones beat Jiri Prochazka? And now we're going to have a fight where if Glover Teixeira wins, he's probably going to retire with the belt. I find it hard to believe that if Glover Teixeira goes out there and beats Jiri Prochazka, which is a very real possibility, I think he probably retires in the cage because he's made all the money he's going to make in the UFC. And I know a third fight would be a big fight, but he's proven everything that he needs to prove. He has nothing left to prove. He's been around forever. He's fought in the UFC forever. He's fought the who's who. He's won the title. He's lost the title, and now he's won it back. And I just don't think he's going to stick around for a trilogy against Jiri Prochazka. And this is why I would have preferred maybe a Jiri Prochazka versus Magomed Ankalaev title fight. And I love Glover. I'm happy he's getting a title shot, but I would just hate for him to win the title, brutally finish Jiri Prochazka, and then ride off into the sunset and retire. Even though I would feel great for Glover, I would hate it as a fan because then the legitimacy of the light heavyweight division is now in question again. Because what do you do at that point? I don't know what you do. Because you have Magomed Ankalaev fighting Jan Blachowicz, so that's not going to be a title fight because that's on the very same card. Then let's say the winner of that fight, who are they going to fight? Maybe a Jamal Hill or something for the vacant belt? Or do you give Jiri Prochazka a chance? Or even if Glover Teixeira doesn't retire, you're going to have a Jiri Prochazka Glover Teixeira trilogy would be my guess. So it's like it's kind of holding up the division. And it's just super unfortunate because I really think if Glover wins, it's going to be a feel-good moment. But at the same time, I'm going to hate if he retires with that belt. You know, it just kind of ruins the division a bit, even though I love Glover Teixeira. So let me know what you guys think about all these reasons that I hate UFC 282. Don't forget to comment. Is there any reasons that I missed that I should be complaining about UFC 282? Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.